Hi, guys. I'm Elizabeth Pike. I'm the Director of Privacy Policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so focusing on the theme of systems, I'm going to talk about systems of collection, systems of use, with a focus on biospecimens and genetic material as sort of the case study. I will also begin with the typical disclaimer of federal employees that the opinions expressed in this presentation are my own, don't reflect that of the Department of Health and Human Service or any other government entity. Okay, I'm going to start with the two slides that are my point in full. So again, like Warren said, feel free to stop listening. So the point is this. First, nearly every American has had their genetic material collected and stored in databases for possible subsequent use without their knowledge or consent. Oh, Blue Jeans Network. And two, there are serious consequences, both ethical and legal, for doing this wrong. So let's consider the implications. We're not in Kansas. Let's move forward purposefully. I figured I'd give you a little overview, so if you start to wane, you can sort of pull yourself back and be like, only this much left. First, why do we care about genetics? We've talked a little bit about it before, so I won't touch on it in too much depth. What is the move and the push towards universal inclusion in databases? How do we all get there? How is our information used? What are the justifications for the non-consensual use, and why, in my opinion, do they fall short? And what are some next steps? What should we be thinking about as we realize we're not in Kansas? It's a great metaphor. I'm just going to keep hammering it. Okay, so why genetic material? Here are the three questions we're going to talk about here. Why genetic material? Well, as one of my co-people sitting on the table has told me this morning, he doesn't believe it's the book of life. It's our immortal physical soul. I agree, but there are important things that our genetics tell us about who we are, who we're related to, who we might become. It doesn't tell us everything. We don't even know what it does tell us. We're still in the process of learning. So we do know that there are correlations between our genes, our unique sequence of DNA, and who we are now. Diseases we might get in the future, they're not absolute necessarily, they're not one-to-one, but they're important. Why do we share it? Why do we make these big databases? Because figuring out which variants in our incredibly long string of DNA will result in disease is a really tricky process that requires big collections to have sufficient statistical power to tell us this variant is correlated with this, when you've just got lots of change throughout this string of DNA. So we share it. We need to share it. We need to have these collections to learn, to make medical progress, to make all of our lives better. But what are the consequences of doing this badly? I don't know if this is a common knowledge. You get in the weeds of your own work. But how many people know about the lawsuits in Minnesota and Texas over the newborn blood spots? Okay, a handful. I think it's an important cautionary tale, so I'll just sort of go with the broad contours. But the gist of this is that in every state, and I will talk more about this, but in every state, baby's born, first few minutes of baby's life, heel's pricked, blood's taken, it's collected. It's an important public health intervention, right? We want to know if the baby has something that can be diagnosed early, detected, treated, made better, perfect. Consent isn't obtained, again, because it's a public health intervention, and I think also because of circumstances like you're in the midst of a new baby, like you don't want to think about what are the parameters. Each state has different rules about how long those cards are kept. In some states, it's up to 21 years. Often they're kept with a whole host of identifiable information, so mother's name, date of birth, hospital in which you were born. And they are a gold mine for researchers, right? It is an unbiased sample of the entire population. You don't worry about selection bias. You don't worry about people opting out in ways that skew your results. So perfect. Most states have very limited third-party uses. So you've got these big collections. You've got very few limits on how they can be used. Awesome, what can go wrong? Until a bunch of parents find out that their kids' genetic material is being used. They weren't asked, they weren't asked to consent, they had no knowledge of this. And in Texas and Minnesota, those parents sued. And the upshot is the court sided with the parents, and both Texas and Minnesota ended up destroying, incinerating their entire collections of this material. Again, we have no way of knowing what hampering effects that will have on medical advances we could have made, but it's not ideal. It's not the ideal outcome for anyone. So let's do it right. I think when we think about universal inclusion in genetic databases, a lot of us might think of the Precision Medicine Initiative, right? This is President Obama's goal of getting 1 million people's data, including genetic, lifestyle, environmental, Fitbit data, a whole bunch of data, medical records, tied together into a sandbox so that researchers can have access, play, learn, make these really important advances. But the actual start of all of us being in databases was much, much earlier. So let's tear the calendar pages off. Let's go back in time. In 1999, RAND Corporation was commissioned to sort of say, how many biospecimens are there? How many have been collected? Where do things stand? And if we're going back to the earlier slide that showed data storage, we're at that sort of inflection point before it started skyrocketing. So this is back in 1999. And what the RAND Corporation found was that there were 307 million samples from 178 million people, which at the time was nearly 2/3 of the population, and that it was growing at a rate of 20 million samples per year. Okay, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a mathematician, I don't do complex equations, but I can do 20 million times the number of years. And where that leads us is to, simple math says it's approximately 600 million samples that have been collected and stored as of today. Again, this is numbers pre the sequencing of the human genome, pre all the technology that allows for easy collection, easy sharing, easy sequencing. So we're in a world where scholars have reasonably concluded that every single one of us is in there. How? How do we get in? And really, there are 4 main ways. So the first is medical waste, right? You go to the doctor, they take a blood sample, they need to run some tests. More often than not, they take more than is strictly needed for the test. And this isn't for nefarious reasons. This is, we might need to retest, we might need to calibrate our machines, like all of that's great. When they're done, they have the option, right? They've got a vial, they've got blood, they could just toss it, hygienically we hope. Or they can say, let's sell it. And that is routinely what is done. The RAND, based on RAND Corporation numbers, they concluded that approximately 88% of Americans have medical waste samples stored, collected and stored. And under HIPAA again is what's going to regulate the subsequent use of this material. If they're de-identified, and again, we're going to put de-identified, I think, kind of in air quotes, given what we've talked about the number of databases that are out there, the number of things that are being linked. So if de-identified, per HIPAA, removing the identifier's name, social, birth date, address, there aren't very many limits. And even if identifiable or identified, again, it's still usable. Newborn screening, we already talked a bit about that, but mandated in all 50 states. There's generally no consent for the process. Approximately 4 million samples collected per year, over 100 million samples stored. Again, each state has a patchwork of how they regulate it and what's permitted and what's allowed, but often it's retained for years with identifying information, few limits on third-party access and use, and just an incredibly rich data source. It's the entire country in there. The third way, hopefully not we, but possibly any of us could get into these databases is through interaction with the criminal justice system. We have databases in the states and then a federal one that's sort of a little more attenuated. But there are 14 million profiles in these databases. It includes, and again, every state can pick who gets in, so they all have different parameters, but convicted felons, convicted misdemeanors, sometimes merely arrested and you get in a database. Sometimes you're a victim and you get in a database. Sometimes you walked through the crime scene and you're in a database. Sometimes you were excluded as not being someone who's under suspicion, you're in the database. We've seen movies where you deliberately collect the samples, right? Come on in, have some coffee, do stupid things faster. Leave your DNA on the coffee, we're just gonna run some tests. Once you're in, it's very hard to get out. So fingers crossed for all of us. And then finally, through online genetic testing. So, right, these companies, you spit, you swab your cheek, you spit in a cup, you submit your material, you receive information about either your ancestry or information about your genetic predispositions. 23andMe has over 2 million users, and the model for most of these companies is actually not making money from the money you pay them. So I pay $100, you give me my information. That's not where the profit lies. The profit lies in collecting large groups of people, I'm gonna move faster, and selling it on the back end. So, okay, what are the uses? Again, three main ones: research. Researchers use DNA collected from all of the context. Again, it's governed by the common rule. We think that the ethical protections are informed consent and third-party review. If it's de-identified, there aren't that many protections that are in place. Now we were told that no one cares about these court cases. I do. So in the commercial sector, one of the ideas is, right, like you take my genetic material, you then turn around and profit from it. When people push back and bring lawsuits, the courts have generally been unsympathetic. So we had Morvey Regents where his sort of spleen made good cells that were commercially valuable. In Greenberg versus Miami, we had parents of kids with Canavan who banded together to learn more about it. And the researcher found stuff, made a test that could test for it, patented that test, and then sold the testing at very high dollar amounts. And the parents were like, hey, wait, we did all the work, brought people together. And courts have generally said, no, once it's out of your body, you have no say. Once it's out of your body, your rights evaporate. We don't really want to make informed consent for this because that will chill progress, chill research, so you don't really have much more of a claim. And then, again, the criminal justice system is seeking access to each of the ways that our material has been collected. You can imagine anytime there's a large DNA database and there's a crime with DNA sample, the criminal justice system is going to look for ways to get access. So what are the justifications? Why have these systems sort of gone on where we don't require consent, we don't require third-party review? And there are three major ones. The first is abandonment, and this is actually a legal concept, but it's the idea like you've abandoned your genetic material, you disposed of it, you made no provision to get it back. Once it's determined to be legally abandoned, and this is sort of what all the court cases rely on, once it's determined legally to be abandoned, that property can be used for any purpose without permission. So the question I have is whether we can really abandon our genetic material. By law, it requires two things. It requires an intent to relinquish and a voluntary effectuation of that intent. So when I think of abandonment, I think of like, I have the sofa, I don't want it, I'm putting it on the curb, I'm putting a sign that says free to anyone. I've met all of those steps. I intend to relinquish it. That's a voluntary decision. I've taken steps to make that happen. I don't think that really applies with your genetic material. I think first, it's still in every cell of your body. So have you really, really abandoned it? I mean, it's still part of you. So second, like, how many steps can you take to ensure that you don't abandon your cells? There's a voluntariness requirement, and then there's a sense like I can't sweep up every hair I shed, every skin cell I shed. Like there's traces of DNA in my fingerprints. Like there's nothing a human can reasonably do to not shed their DNA. Again, de-identification is a primary justification, and I think probably what we'll see over the course of the day is the more data that's out there, the more databases that have our information, the more the things that can be linked to us, the less I think we can realistically talk about de-identification. Sure, my name's removed, but if all of these data points can be correlated with all of these data points and that set has my name, like it's just a matter of steps. And I also think there are trade-offs. So the more if you remove all the identifiers, if all you're sharing is my genetic sequence with not a single thing more, that's less helpful, right? Like what you want to know is my medical history. You want to know my lifestyle factors. You want to know the environment I've been exposed to. That's where we get the usefulness. And again, people argue, well, this is just so useful, like don't stop it. And the response I have to that is the data show that people are remarkably willing to share their samples when asked. Some people are not. And if we are going to use theirs, despite a small percent of people being unwilling, what we're saying is we don't care. Why don't we just acknowledge people's preferences and go along with that? So, I mean, I don't have much time, but I think the things we really want to think about, we want to think about data security. We want to think that when promises are made to people about how their genetic information is going to be stored and shared, and the security of that, I think those promises should be kept to the best of our ability, because this is an area where there's a limited ability of individuals to self-help, right? These are systems in place. One person going up against it, it's just impossible. So we've just got to do better system-wide. I do think, okay, my time is up, but I think informed consent at the point of collection is really important. And I think when possible, third-party review prior to use to just ensure that what we're doing serves society's best interest. Okay. Can read that. I'll leave that up while I'm walking. Thanks, guys.